Thank you for watching Gaby's cheating stories. Please subscribe. It just take 1 second. Thank you.
You know when someone told you a story and you never thought you will be in that position? Well, I was one of those people until it happened to me. Hello, I'm Crystal and this is my story. I still remember the day I met Killian like it was yesterday. It was at a charity gala in downtown Los Angeles, one of those events where everyone is dressed to the nines, sipping champagne and pretending to care about the cause. I was there because my best friend Sophia had dragged me along, insisting I needed to get out more. I was 24, fresh out of college and working as a freelance marketer, trying to make a name for myself. Killian, on the other hand, was already a rising star in Hollywood. He was 32, charming, and had this magnetic presence that made everyone in the room gravitate toward him. When our eyes met across the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a spark. He walked over, introduced himself, and we spent the entire evening talking. He was different from what I expected. He wasn't just another arrogant actor. He was thoughtful, funny, and surprisingly down to earth. By the end of the night, he asked for my number, and I gave it to him without hesitation. Our first date was a week later. He took me to this cozy little Italian restaurant in Malibu, and we talked for hours. He told me about his dreams of becoming a serious actor, not just a pretty face in action movies. I shared my ambitions of building a career in marketing and maybe starting my own agency someday. There was an instant connection, and I knew right then that he was someone special. Over the next few months, we grew closer. He'd take me to movie premieres, and I'd introduce him to my favorite hole-in-the-wall restaurants. We were inseparable, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had found my person. Looking back now, I wish I could relive those early days. The innocence, the excitement, the love that felt so pure. But life has a way of twisting even the most beautiful stories into something unrecognizable. Falling in love with Killian was effortless. He had this way of making me feel like the most important person in the world. He'd surprise me with little gifts, a book he thought I'd like, a handwritten note, or my favorite coffee waiting for me on his kitchen counter. He was attentive, kind, and always put me first. We'd spend weekends exploring LA, hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains, or just lounging at home watching old movies. He introduced me to his world, the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, but he also made sure I knew that he valued me for who I was, not just as an accessory to his life. About a year into our relationship, he took me to Paris. It was my first time in Europe, and he wanted to show me his favorite city. We stayed in this beautiful boutique hotel near the Seine, and every day felt like a dream. One evening, as we stood on the Pont d'Arts bridge, he got down on one knee and proposed. I said yes without a second thought. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair. We got married on a beach in Malibu, surrounded by close friends and family. I wore a simple white dress, and he looked dashing in a light gray suit. It was perfect. I remember thinking as we exchanged vows that this was it, the beginning of forever. I had no idea how wrong I was. The first few years of our marriage were everything I had hoped for. We bought a beautiful house in the Hollywood Hills, and I started taking on more clients for my marketing business. Killian's career was taking off, and he was landing bigger roles in major films. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. When I found out I was pregnant with Bob, we were both over the moon. Killian was filming on location at the time, but he flew back to be with me for the birth. Holding our son for the first time, I felt like our family was complete. But as Bob grew older, things started to change. Killian's career demanded more of his time, and he was often away for months at a time. I threw myself into motherhood and my work, trying to fill the void his absence left. We still had our moments, family vacations, date nights, lazy Sundays, but there was a growing distance between us. I told myself it was normal, that every marriage had its ups and downs. But deep down, I knew something was off. I just never imagined it would lead to where it did. By the time Bob turned 3, our routines were firmly established. I'd wake up early, get him ready for preschool, and then spend the day working on my marketing projects. Killian, when he was home, would leave for the gym by 6 a.m., followed by meetings with his agent or script readings. But it wasn't just his work schedule that bothered me. It was the events, the endless premieres, after parties, and industry gatherings. He'd come home late, smelling of alcohol and perfume that wasn't mine. I'd ask him about his night, and he'd brush me off, saying it was just work. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, but it was hard. I'd see photos of him online, surrounded by beautiful actresses, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. We started arguing more about his schedule, his priorities, his lack of time for us. He'd apologize, promise to do better, but nothing ever changed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed to trust him. But trust is a fragile thing, and once it starts to crack, it's hard to keep it from shattering completely. The breaking point came when Killian left for France to film a new movie. He'd be gone for 3 months, and I was dreading it. I tried to stay positive, focusing on Bob and my work, but the loneliness was overwhelming. The house felt emptier without him, even though he hadn't been around much lately. The silence was deafening, and I found myself scrolling through his social media, looking for updates on his filming. I told myself it was just another work trip, that we'd get through it like we always did. But this time felt different. The distance between us had been growing for months, and his absence only magnified it. We'd talk on the phone, but the conversations felt forced, like we were going through the motions. He'd ask about Bob, I'd ask about the movie, and then there'd be an awkward pause before one of us made an excuse to hang up. That's when I met Fabian. He was a graphic designer I hired for a client project. I'd been struggling to find someone who could bring my vision to life, and a friend recommended him. From the moment we started working together, I could tell he was different. He was talented, yes, but he was also easy to talk to. He had this way of making me feel heard, something I hadn't felt in a long time. First, it was just work. We'd meet at coffee shops or my house, brainstorming ideas and going over designs. But as the weeks went by, our conversations started to drift. We'd talk about our lives, our dreams, our frustrations. He told me about his recent breakup, and I found myself opening up about the strain in my marriage. It felt good to have someone listen, to feel like I wasn't alone. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just venting to a friend. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was a spark between us, a connection I hadn't felt in years. I tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. Looking back, I know I should have stopped it before it went too far. I should have set boundaries, kept things professional. But I was weak, and I let myself fall into a trap I never saw coming. Fabian and I grew closer with each passing day. What started as a professional relationship quickly turned into something more personal. He'd come over to the house to work, and we'd spend hours brainstorming ideas, laughing over inside jokes, and sharing stories about our lives. He had this way of making me feel seen, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Killian was always so preoccupied with his career, and while I understood the demands of his job, it didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. One evening, after a particularly long work session, we ended up sharing a bottle of wine. Bob was asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the music playing in the background. Conversation turned from work to more personal topics, our dreams, our regrets, the things we wished we could change. Fabian opened up about his recent breakup, how he'd given so much of himself to someone who didn't appreciate it. I found myself nodding along, relating to his words more than I wanted to admit. "Sometimes," he said, leaning closer, "I think we stay in situations that don't serve us because we're afraid of what's on the other side." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was that what I was doing? Staying in a marriage that felt more like a partnership of convenience than a true connection? I didn't have an answer, but the way Fabian looked at me, like I was the only person in the room, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Before I knew it, we were kissing. It was impulsive, reckless, and completely out of character for me. But in that moment, I didn't care. It felt good to be wanted, to feel desired. When we finally pulled away, I was breathless, my heart racing with a mix of guilt and excitement. "This can't happen again," I said, more to convince myself than him. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. The next few days were a blur. I tried to focus on Bob and my work, but my mind kept drifting back to that night. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that I could put behind me. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about Fabian. When he texted me a few days later, asking if we could meet to go over some design revisions, I hesitated. I knew I should say no, that I should keep things professional. But the temptation was too strong. We met at my house again, and this time there was no pretending. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and before long we were crossing a line I never thought I'd cross. Looking back, I know I should have stopped it. I should have ended things before they went too far. But I was selfish, and I let myself get caught up in the moment. The affair lasted for weeks, and with each passing day, I felt myself sinking deeper into a hole I couldn't climb out of. Fabian and I would meet at my house when Bob was at preschool, or at his apartment when I could get away. It was reckless, selfish, and completely out of character for me. But I couldn't stop. At first, I told myself it was just physical, a way to fill the void that Killian's absence had left. But the more time I spent with Fabian, the more I realized it was more than that. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. He listened to me, made me laugh, and made me feel like I was more than just a wife and mother. I knew what I was doing was wrong. Every time I looked at Bob, I felt a pang of guilt. How could I betray Killian, the man I'd vowed to spend my life with? How could I risk everything we'd built for a fleeting moment of happiness? But the truth was, I wasn't happy. I hadn't been for a long time. Killian and I had grown apart, and no amount of pretending could change that. Fabian made me feel seen, wanted, and desired in a way Killian hadn't in years. I told myself I was in control, that I could end it whenever I wanted. But the truth was, I was in over my head. One afternoon, Fabian and I were at his apartment going over designs for a client project. Or at least, that's what we told ourselves. But as soon as the door closed behind us, the pretense fell away. We were in the middle of kissing when my phone buzzed. It was Killian calling from France. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Aren't you going to answer that?" Fabian asked, pulling away. I shook my head, silencing the call. It's not important, but it was important. It was a reminder of the life I was risking, the family I was tearing apart. When I got home that night, I listened to Killian's voicemail. He sounded tired but happy, telling me about his day and asking how Bob and I were doing. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, and I broke down in tears. I told myself I'd end it, that I'd cut things off with Fabian and focus on my marriage. But the next time he texted me, I found myself making excuses to see him again. Looking back, I know I should have stopped it. I should have ended things before they went too far. But I was weak, and I let myself get caught up in the moment. The affair continued, and with each passing day, I felt myself slipping further and further away from the person I used to be. I was lying to Killian, lying to myself, and risking everything for a relationship that could never be. But the worst part was, I didn't care. Or at least, I told myself I didn't. It all came crashing down one afternoon when my parents showed up unannounced. They'd flown in from New York to surprise me and Bob, and I wasn't prepared for their arrival. Fabian and I were at the house working on a project, or at least that's what we told ourselves. But the moment my parents walked through the door, I knew the jig was up. The look on their faces said it all. They didn't say anything at the time, but I could see the disappointment in their eyes. My mom gave me a tight-lipped smile, while my dad avoided eye contact altogether. They stayed for a few hours, playing with Bob and making small talk, but the tension in the air was palpable. After they left, I felt sick to my stomach. I knew they knew, and the guilt was unbearable. I tried to convince myself that they wouldn't say anything, that they'd keep my secret out of loyalty to me. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the look on my parents' faces, the way they glanced at Fabian and then at me, putting the pieces together. I thought about Killian, thousands of miles away in France, oblivious to what was happening at home. I thought about Bob, innocent and unaware of the chaos surrounding him. I told myself I'd end it, that I'd cut things off with Fabian and focus on my marriage. But the next day, when he texted me, I found myself making excuses to see him again. We met at his apartment, and as soon as the door closed behind us, the guilt and fear melted away. For a few hours, I could pretend that everything was okay, that I wasn't risking everything for a fleeting moment of happiness. But the truth was, I was living in a fantasy. And like all fantasies, it was bound to come crashing down. The final blow came a few days later, when Killian returned from France. He'd finished filming early and decided to surprise me. I was at home with Bob when he walked through the door, and for a moment I thought I could keep up the charade. But then he pulled out his phone and showed me the footage from the hidden security cameras he'd installed before he left. He'd been suspicious for months, he said, and had installed the cameras as a precaution. The look on his face when he played the videos, it's something I'll never forget. He was heartbroken, furious, and completely done with me. At first, I told myself it was just physical, a way to fill the void that Killian's absence had left. But the more time I spent with Fabian, the more I realized it was more than that. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. He listened to me, made me laugh, and made me feel like I was more than just a wife and mother. I knew what I was doing was wrong. Every time I looked at Bob, I felt a pang of guilt. How could I betray Killian, the man I'd vowed to spend my life with? How could I risk everything we'd built for a fleeting moment of happiness? But the truth was, I wasn't happy. I hadn't been for a long time. Killian and I had grown apart, and no amount of pretending could change that. Fabian made me feel seen, wanted, and desired in a way Killian hadn't in years. I told myself I was in control, that I could end it whenever I wanted. But the truth was, I was in over my head. One afternoon, Fabian and I were at his apartment going over designs for a client project. Or at least that's what we told ourselves. But as soon as the door closed behind us, the pretense fell away. We were in the middle of kissing when my phone buzzed. It was Killian calling from France. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Aren't you going to answer that?" Fabian asked, pulling away. I shook my head, silencing the call. It's not important, but it was important. It was a reminder of the life I was risking, the family I was tearing apart. When I got home that night, I listened to Killian's voicemail. He sounded tired but happy, telling me about his day and asking how Bob and I were doing. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, and I broke down in tears. I told myself I'd end it, that I'd cut things off with Fabian and focus on my marriage. But the next time he texted me, I found myself making excuses to see him again. Looking back, I know I should have stopped it. I should have ended things before they went too far. But I was weak, and I let myself get caught up in the moment. The affair continued, and with each passing day, I felt myself slipping further and further away from the person I used to be. I was lying to Killian, lying to myself, and risking everything for a relationship that could never be. But the worst part was, I didn't care. Or at least I told myself I didn't. When my parents left that day, I knew they had pieced everything together. The way my mom avoided eye contact and my dad's stiff demeanor told me they were grappling with what they'd seen. They didn't confront me directly, but the weight of their silent judgment was crushing. That night, my mom texted me, "We need to talk when you're ready." I never responded. How could I? I was too ashamed to face them, too tangled in my own web of lies to explain myself. A week later, Killian returned home unexpectedly. He'd finished filming early and wanted to surprise me. I was in the kitchen with Bob when he walked in, and for a moment I thought I could pretend everything was normal. But the look on his face, cold, distant, and furious, told me he already knew. He didn't yell. He didn't even cry. He just sat me down, pulled out his phone, and showed me the footage from the hidden security cameras he'd installed before leaving for France. He'd been suspicious for months, he said, and had set up the cameras as a precaution. Watching those videos felt like watching my life unravel in real time. There was no denying what he'd seen. "Pack your things," he said calmly. "You're leaving." The divorce was swift and brutal. Killian's lawyers made sure I got nothing. No house, no alimony, not even shared custody of Bob. He argued that my actions made me an unfit mother, and the court sided with him. My parents, who had always adored Killian, were horrified by what I'd done. When Killian showed them the footage, they were speechless. My dad couldn't even look at me, and my mom just shook her head in disappointment. I moved into a small apartment, alone and broken. Fabian tried to reach out, but I couldn't face him. What we'd had wasn't love, it was a distraction, a mistake that cost me everything. Now, as I sit here writing this, I'm filled with regret. I lost my family, my home, and my self-respect. Killian moved on, and Bob barely remembers me. I'm a stranger to my own son, and it's all my fault. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences are irreversible.
If you like this story and felt connected, please subscribe. Thanks for watching Gaby's cheating stories. See you on the next one.